Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for joining. So in today's class, before we start the class, I have this assignment. I have shared a project with assignments to the to the GitHub repo. So please get that project to your computer, just clone it and add it to your Anypoint Studio. And if possible, before you debug it, try to understand the flow and understand what the response will be, the response body, and also the status code, and then run it in debug mode and make sure you understand it, you got it correct. And then at the end, just prepare a PDF and upload your assignment here. So what you can do is you can just use Google Docs as we have been doing. In Google Docs, you can create a table. Let me show here, move this one. So go here. For those of you who are new to Google Doc, just create a new Google Doc and insert a table. So there are around 14 or so questionnaires. So you create a table of 14 or 15, let's say, rows and 3 columns. So you do like this. So this will be a question, or this is flow name, and this will be payload response. The response body, rather, response body, and this one response code. Then once you have this, you can just save it as PDF, download as PDF. You have here, download it as PDF, and you can submit your PDF. If you don't have Microsoft Word, you can use Google Doc. Okay, that's the assignment. This is so on. I am planning on handling errors. We will have 2 assignments. This is the first one, and another one we will have on the rest of the other topics. I'm trying to be as exhaustive as possible to cover every concept as much as possible. So today we will continue from where we stopped yesterday. So yesterday we saw errors can be handled at different levels, at an application level, at a flow level, and processor level. So the error handling process starts at a processor level. If you have a single process with an error handling for that processor, it first checks that, then it goes to the flow level, then it goes to the application level. So we will see these 2 today, the flow level and processor level error handling. The other thing also we discussed yesterday, on the error handler, we can add 1 or more error handling scopes, which are on error propagate and on error continue. And we saw what each one of them are. On error propagate is, it just propagates the error comes in and error gets out. But everything in this process, on error propagate, every processor gets executed, we said, and the response is an error. Whereas with error continue, the same thing, all the processors on error continue scope get executed, and even if an error gets thrown to this scope, what gets out is a success response. So that means if this is the calling flow, then the status code of the response will be 200 for success. And the other things also we saw, by default, we said by default for success, the response body is a payload and the status code is 200. Whereas for an error by default, the error is a description and the status code is 500. And we saw for an HTTP listener, we can customize this. And by modifying these things, we checked what we were getting yesterday. So today, let's start with flow level error handling. So all the resources that I am using in this Google Slides, I got them from blogs, or either on the MuleSoft website, or from the Anypoint platform fundamentals training and so on. And I have added the links for the resources at the end. So let's start with error handling at flow level. So see what we have here. Let's spend the time here. So this is a calling flow. As you can see, there is no subflow. And in the error handling section, which is this one, there is no any. Let me make sure. Let me first meet all of you. Then I will ask you questions and your answers. Please share them on the chat. Okay. So see this one. So what do we see here? There is a listener here, an HTTP listener. An HTTP listener is here. A flow gate is triggered, and an error occurs here. Let's say E is for error and P is for processor. So an error happens here. Okay, after that, in here in the error handler scope, there is no any custom error handler. So the default error handler will handle the error that means. And in this case, what we said yesterday is, in this case, when an error happens here, then the error gets propagated to, actually in here we don't see the default error handler. So MuleSoft's default error handler, let's say it is here. So this one, the error will get propagated to MuleSoft's default error handler because we have not put any error handler scopes here. So it gets propagated to here, and MuleSoft's default error handler, what it does is it returns the error to the caller. So the error gets to the caller. So you see it is read in, read out, similar to the same as on error propagate. The other point also here we notice is one is an error happens here, then the subsequent processors, they don't get executed. So it doesn't go to here. This one doesn't get executed. That's what this is showing us on the right. If you start from the bottom, error gets thrown, which is in E. So we have not set up any error handler. So Mule's default error handler will get executed, and that one just rethrows the error to the caller. So the error at the end will be the response. So this one is a default when we have not added any kind of error handling capability. Okay, the second one, let's see this one. So this one is this is on error propagate scope, and it is the same as the default MuleSoft's default error handler. So the same thing. What we see here is that an error happens here. Now the error will get propagated to on error propagate, and on error propagate is read in, read out. So this will get thrown to the response, to the calling body. That will be the response. The same way in here, the subsequent processors don't get executed. So subsequent processors not executed is what we see here. The same thing here on the right, what you see is an error gets thrown from processor E, then the error gets propagated to on error propagate scope, and error propagate scope rethrows the error to the caller, and that will be the response. So the response will be an error. So as you can see, on error propagate for a calling flow, on error propagate and the Mule's default error handler, they have the same behavior. Here also you can see subsequent processors don't get executed. Okay, so let's just first see the concept here, and then I have flows. We will run them in the debug mode and understand it in detail. So let's come. What about when we have on error continuous scope here? So we have on error continuous scope, the same way error happens on processor E, error occurs here. So the error gets propagated to the error handler. So red in, green out for on error continuous. So what gets the response in this case will be a success response. So in here we can set we may set in this on error continue payload and status code and so on, and we may customize the what should be returned, and it can return whatever payload we set up on the on error continue scope. So that is what we see here. Let me move this down. That is what we see here on the right. Error gets thrown error gets thrown on processor E, then on error continue gets executed. Here on error continue gets executed. So red is coming in here, whereas from here on error continue score, the output is green. Okay. So let's first see these concepts. Let's first see these concepts and then we'll continue to the next. So I have different flows here that I built, and let me show you. It starts from here, example 1A. So even before we debug it, let's take a screenshot and understand it. So this is on error propagate. I can take a screenshot from here on error propagate, go to Google Sliders and paste it here. So we can understand before we debug it, even we can tell what the answer will be. So we have a listener. Then we are setting a payload here. The payload is success started flow. So it is a string, as you can see. And there is a validator here that checks if it is a number. Is the payload a number? No, it is not. So this will throw an error. Then what this means is this part and this part will not get executed. They will not be executed. So the error from here will propagate to here. That's what we'll see. And since this is on error propagate, which is read in, read out, it will propagate the error back to here. So we are setting up we are creating a payload here. This is our final payload. However, what will get rethrown from here to here is an error. So depending on the setup in the listener, we will see what it can return. But by default, it will return the error description and a status code of 500. However, we can make it to return whatever payload we set up here and whatever status code we put here. We will do that after we complete this. So now let me send a request and show you this one. Let's check if when we run it in debug mode, if we see something similar to this one. So come here, example, this is example 1A. Then I will ask you example 1B. The next question is we will make it interactive rather than only me speaking. Okay. So come here. So you see there is a payload, success started flow. Now next there will be an error. Here is a validator. When I click next processor, you see here when I click this, it has stopped here. When I click next, it will throw an error. So you see there is an error. The error is, it is telling me the string success started flow is not a valid integer value. So the payload is not an integer value is what it is saying. Now, notice it will not go to the next processor, to the set payload and logger. Rather, it will go to the on error propagate error handler. So click next. You see it has come here on error propagate. So from here, it will not get back to here. Rather, it will just exit. That means it will send the response. So if I do this and come back here, you see the payload, which is success started flow, was the payload, is not a valid integer value. That's what we get. So this is the first example. Let's see the second one. So example 1B. Example 1B is this one. So I will take a screenshot and show you, and you share in the chat your response. So let me delete this. Okay, or I can create a new slide to show you this one. And move this to somewhere. See this one? It is the same. The only difference is here we have an error continue. So if our HTTP listener here is the configuration is the default configuration. The question I have for you is what will be the response body and what will be the response status code. You can put your answers in the chat. From here, this one, the payload is success, started flow. We have a payload here. Then it fails here. This failure is happening. I guess this one. Okay, so an error happens in here, and a red error gets propagated to on error continue. Then from here, what gets the output from here will be success. So it will give response of 200. So that means it is success. And if it is success, for success, what it should return is not from the error response, but rather from the response section. And in the response section, here by default, the status is the code is 200. That is why it is returning 200. And what it should return for the body should be the payload. And the payload is until the error happened. The payload we have, okay, we are setting a payload here. So it should return error main flow. So this is the last payload we have. So it should return this one and a status code of 200. Let's check this. It should return this one, the last payload. The last payload and a status code of 200 is what it should return. So let's send a request to be send, come here. So we have the payload first, then come to the processor that throws the error. Now it comes here, the error has been created, it is on error continue, but we are setting a payload. The payload now will change, and the output is green, so it is success. It will return 200 and whatever the payload, the last payload is. And since we are setting up a payload here on the error continue section itself, that should be what we should get. So if we come here, see we have the status code. I hope you see it. Yeah, here 200 okay. It shows here 200 okay, and in here it shows error main flow. So error main flow, the last payload. So if it is on error continue, since it is green out, the status code is 200, and what it should return is the last payload. Okay, let's see the next one. We'll practice more and understand it better. So the next one, how is it different with the first one? Yeah, okay, yeah, it is different. So 1C, so we have 1C here. And what do you expect will be the response body and the status code for 1C? So I'm pasting it here. Let me exit from here and pasting it here. So as you can see, we don't have, we have not added any error handling scopes in here. So that means default, Mulus default error handler will take care of it. And an error is being generated in this processor. So first, let's say green, the flow was green. Now it is red. So from here, it goes to the default processor, which is here. So in that case, the processors, after the processors that throws the error don't get, the subsequent processors don't get executed. So it doesn't go to here. From here, it gets propagated to here. And by default, Mulus default error handler is the same as on error propagate. You can think there is on error propagated. So the question I have now for you is what will be the status code and what will be the response. The assignments I have also are the same like this. So let me give you 1 minute and see error description and 500 invalid number. Yeah, okay. Yeah, invalid number and error description are the same. Okay, I hope it is from starting this one. Yes. So the error description is the payload is not a valid number, so it should return that one and 500. Perfect. Let's check this. Send. Let me go here. 1C. Send. And come here. So maximize this, increase this. Oh yeah, we need only 1C. This should be enough. Okay, perfect. So there is that logger there. Click next. It comes here. An error will be thrown, and the error description is this one. The payload is not a valid integer value. That's the error description. And after that, it will go to the Mulus default error handler. So we don't see, it doesn't come to this block because there isn't any error handling scope here. By implicitly, that will be handled and you get the response. So the response, if you come here, the status code is 500 server error REC, and the body is the payload, which is success started flow, which was the payload for the validator, is not a valid integer value. Perfect. Now let's continue to the next example. I have 1C now. Okay, now we are going to see when we have a child flows. So when the main flow calls child flows. So you remember, I think it was from week 7 or so, we saw the different types of flows and there are differences. So there is flow or main flow, private flow, and subflow. And we said subflow doesn't have an error handler, as you can see. In subflow, we just have only processors. It doesn't have error handler. So if you have a subflow, error is handled by the calling flow itself. Whereas if you have private flow, the private flow has its own error handling capability. You see here, error handling in here. So for a private flow, we have, it has its own error handling, its own error handler, whereas a subflow, it doesn't. So now when we have a main flow that calls child flows, what is the behavior? Let's see. I think this one is better. Let me show you here. So see this one. So what's happening is the calling flow is the upper rectangle. Calling flow, we have calling flow here with its own error handler. And we have a child flow here with its own error handler. So this is a private flow. That means it is not subflow because subflow doesn't have this part. Okay, and now what it is saying is an error is happening here. So when an error happens here, the same way, the error will get propagated to the error handler, which is on error propagate scope now, and subsequent processors will not get executed, so it will not go to here. And from here, the response to the calling flow, since this is on error propagate, it will send back or rethrow the error to the calling flow, to this one, to the flow reference. And flow reference here is getting an error that came from the child flow, and it will propagate that error to the error handler of the main flow, which is in this case on error propagate. And from the previous examples we saw, error propagates the error to the caller, to here. So that is what we see here. So on the right, you can see the summary on the right. Error gets thrown, which is in E. Then on error propagate, scope gets executed, which is this one on the bottom. And we know on error propagate is error in, error out. So it throws the error. So here is, this one is what the flow reference gets from the child flow. And then the flow reference, it sends the error to on error propagate, which is to the error handler here. And we know on error propagates the error, so it throws that error, and that is what we get here. So this is when we have a main flow calling a child flow. Let's see other scenarios. What about this one? This one is different, as you can see. We have here on error continue. This is on error continue, whereas the bottom one is on error propagate. Let me delete this so that it doesn't confuse us. Okay, so error is being created here. So subsequent processors will not get executed. This error will propagate to on error propagate. And we know on error propagate is the error. So that error will go to the flow reference. And this flow reference then sends the error to on error continue. And we know on error continue is red in, green out. So this green will be what will be sent to the source, the caller. So that's what we see on the right here. An error gate is thrown on E, on error propagate scope gets executed. This one is this guy. And we know on error propagates throws the error. So we have this error thrown to the flow reference. And from the flow reference, the error gets thrown to on error continue, which is this on error continue. And we know on error continue sends success. This is another scenario. I hope these things are clear. If it is too much information, take more time and digest it. Now we have on error continue scope in the child flow. See, now we have on error continue scope in the child flow. So an error happens here on E, like the previous example is, so subsequent processors will not get executed. This error will propagate to on error continue scope. However, we know on error continue, it send the output from on error continue is success. So it sends this one to the flow reference, and then the flow reference, it will continue as if nothing happened. So this will get all the subsequent processors will get executed because the flow response, the flow reference, it is getting success from the child flow. So it will not fail. That means it will not go to this. It will not go to this error handler because it is not an error. What it is getting is success. So the subsequent processors, they will get executed. And as a result, it will go up to the end. So that is what we see here. So error get thrown at E, and on error continue scope gets executed here. Then all subsequent processors in calling flow get executed, and at the end we get success. We get the last payload and a status code of 200 by default configuration. So, okay, before we continue with this one, I have questions. Let's do the questions and try to understand that. So, example 2A, let's start with 2A. First one is this one. So, let me ask you what will be, or let's do this one together and then the rest, you'll try them. So, add new slide and paste it here. Slideshow. Okay. Which one is it? Yep, this one. Slideshow here. Okay. Okay, I think where are the lines coming from? This one. Should I make it slideshow now? Okay, perfect. However, annotate is gone. That's fine. I think this one is visible. So example 2A, we have a private flow. As you can see, we have a private flow with its own error handling capability. However, in the error handling section, we have not added any error handling scopes. So MuleSoft default error handler will take care of this. And an error happens in this processor, which validates the payload, a payload of string. So what will happen is if we come here, so this is green up to here. Let's go here. And then this one, it sends a request to here, it goes to here. In here, an error happens, and this error will be taken care of by MuleSoft default error handler. So that means the subsequent processors here will not be executed. So, and we know Mule's default error handler is the same as on error propagate. So it will propagate the error. So it is read in, read out. The error will go here. So if this gets an error, then one thing, subsequent processors will not get executed. And from here, this error, since there is an error handling scope on error propagate or on error continue in here, this one will also get taken care of by Mule's default error handler. So from here, it will go to Mule's default error handler, and at the end, what we get will be a status code of 500 and error description. So let's check this. Send to A. Send. Come here. Next processor. Next. We see now an error will be thrown here. Error. The error is the same still. Now the flow reference also gets an error, and from here, since we don't have error handling scope here, then we'll get the response in Postman, and we see the status code is 500, and the body is that the payload is not a valid integer value. Now let me ask you the next ones, and I expect your answers. 2B. Let's start with 2B. Where does start and where does it end? 2B is, yep, okay. 2B is like this. So it's like this. Take your time and try to understand this. I will try on error how to make it. I am trying to adjust it so that you can see the payload at the end. Yeah. So what will be the response body and the payload for this one? I'll bring it here. Let me delete these ones. Insert a new slide and paste it here. So as you can see, I have trimmed the upper processors, but you can understand what they are. So listener here, payload is being set here, logger here, flow reference here. After the flow reference, we have set payload and a logger. So from the flow reference is calling this private flow. And there is this is number validator or processor, and it will generate an error. And in the error handling part, in the error handler, we have an error continuous code. So the question now is, what's the status code and the body? So body and status code. Let me see your charts. Is I'm so sorry. Yeah. Here, red is going to here, and from here, green gets back to here. So since this is on error continue, it will continue until the end. Yeah, okay. So our last answer our last payload is success finished flow with a status code of 200. Let me check your responses again. So 200 success finished flow and success finished flow, yes. Perfect. Yeah, let's check this. Yeah, so this is a main flow calling a child flow. When it behaves differently when the error happens in the child flow versus in the calling flow. Sometimes it is tricky. So let's send a response. Let's send a request. Send a request. Come here. Next. Error will be generated. And from here, success finished private flow will not get executed because error is happening here. I have to make this 2B, not 2A. 2B and clear this. We have seen 2A already. Clear this and send 2B. Come here. Next. So it comes here, an error gets generated. So this processor will not get executed. Now it comes to on error continue. From on error continue, our payload now we change to error finished private flow, and it will be success. That's what gets returned to flow reference. And since it is success, then the main flow will continue as if nothing happened. So we have success finished flow. That is what we should get. So success finished flow with a status code of 200. Perfect. Okay. Now let's see the next one. 2C is, where is 2C? Oh, 2C is, so for 2C, this one, the main flow, it has on error continue error handler, and the private flow also has on error continue. I guess this one should be easy relatively. So what will be the response body and the status code for this one, for 2C? We have on error continue in both cases, for in the calling flow and also in the flow, the child flow, we have on error continue. So what will be the response we get? Let me check. So the error is happening the same way, right? To see the error is happening here in is number. Error is happening here in the private flow. Our errors are happening in private flow. In the example 2, A to C, errors are happening in the private flow. So for 2C, so you see there is payload is being created here, flow reference, call is the private flow. In the private flow, the payload gets from the main flow to the private flow, and here it is being checked if it is a number. It is not, to throw an error. So this one will not get executed. Rather, it will go to here, and this is on error continue, red in, green out. So we are modifying our payload. Our payload now will be error finished private flow. That will be the response that gets back to here. However, since this is success, it will continue processing the subsequent processors in the main flow, which means it will go to here. Now our payload is being modified. Success finished flow with a status code of 200 is what we should get. Let's check 2C. Come here. 2C. Okay, in the flow reference. Next, it comes here. An error will happen there. Then it comes here without processing this one. Then the flow reference will get success. That's why it is continuing. Otherwise, if it was failure from the flow reference, it will go to on error continue here. It will not go to the set payload success finished flow processor. So now, if I come back to Postman, I should get success finished flow with a status code of 200. Success finished flow with a status code of 200. So when we have this is, so the two examples, example 1 and example 2 are flow level. In example 1, we have just one flow. In example 2, we have a main flow calling a child flow. Now let's see when we have a processor level error handler. So for processor level error handler, if you have any processor to add a processor level error handler, you can just add on try scope. So under core, we have try. So you can just bring this try, bring it here and put this there. So as you can see, there is an error handling scope here just for that processor. That is why it is called processor level. Or you can also just right click here, the processor itself, and go to wrap in, and there is try here. There is, we see we have parallel for each, until successful for each, async scope. We have seen many of them already. So you just click try. We'll see until successful, but for now you just click this one. So we have processor level error handling. And when it is processor level error handling, what happens? Let's see. When we have processor level error handling, it is the same as the when we have a main flow calling a child flow. So what happens here is, let me remove this and go to the appropriate examples. Okay, so I have example 3 for that. Examples. Example 2, it goes up to, it doesn't stop at C, it goes up to D. Let's see that, and then we'll go to the processor level. I think we have examples 2D and E as well. Before we go to example 3, let's finish example 2, I think. So we have, we saw example 2C. Now let's see example 2D. Example 2D, what do we have? On the main flow, which is this one, we have on error propagate. On the private flow, we have on error continue. On the error continue here, we are creating a payload, error finished private flow. And here we are creating a payload, error finished main flow. So if an error happens here, example 2D, in the private flow, if an error happens here, what will be the response body and status code? Can you try this one? Example 2D. Think in the child flow and in the main flow. In the child flow, we have on error continue, whereas in the main flow, we have on error propagate. Example 2D. Yes, perfect. Yes. So this one is basically from the slide is, it is, which one is it? Let's see, it is this one, this slide. So you have on error continue in the child flow, then whether you have on error continue or on error propagate in the calling flow, since success is being returned from the child flow, all subsequent processors will get executed and get the final payload and status code of 200. Okay, that is 2D. Let's see 2E. What do we have for 2E? So here we have on error propagate. Here also we have on error propagate. Okay, this should be interesting. Let's pay attention to this one. So example 2E, what do we get? We have the main flow here, flow reference is here, and the main flow has on error propagate, error handler, inside main flow, the payload there, and in here, inside private flow is a payload there, and what we get. Okay, let me see. Example 2E. Example 2E. Shall I show you example 2E? Is it visible? So basically, you have this one. Remember on the error handler for the main flow is on error propagate, and here also on error propagate in the private flow. Okay. So the error is happening here. The error is happening here in example 2E. The error is happening here. So that error will be thrown to the error handler on error propagate, which is read in, read out. Yes, there is, the payload is being modified, but it will send also an error object. So the error object will come to the flow reference here. So, and since the flow reference is getting an error object, it will not continue to the subsequent flows. Then this flow reference will throw the error to the error handler in here, which is on error propagate. And on error propagate itself, even if we are creating a payload inside main flow, still there is error object on error propagate restores the error itself. And by default in here, what we are in the configuration, our response is error description. It is not payload. If this one, since it is error description and there is still error, that is what we should get give us with a status code of 500. Let's check it. Example 2E. So continue. Error gets thrown, goes to on error propagate. This one also sends error to the flow reference. This is a flow reference. It shows still an error. Then the subsequent processors will not get executed. It will go to on error propagate, and still we have the error object on error propagate restores this error, and that is what we get at the end or in Postman. So status code of 500, and the answer is the payload is not a valid integer value. We will see if we want to get the payload from the error handler. If we get the payload, what we do is after we finish. Let's first finish all of them, and then we'll modify them. We'll modify for the HTTP listener. We can modify, as we said, we can modify what we want to get. Okay, let's see the example series. I guess I have example series. What do I have in example series? Yeah. Okay, let's first see example series. So here we have a triscope, which is processor level error handler. So let me copy this and take it to Google Slides. Copy and paste it here. So what we are saying here is, slideshow will work now. Okay, perfect. This is working nice. So let me move to here. So what do we see here? We have the processor level error handler, which is a triscope is here. So in that triscope, we can add one or more processors. We have this number validator here, and we have a logger after it here. And the triscope, it has its own error handler. You see on error continue is what I have here. So I can put the error handling scopes in here for the processor level, and here the flow level. So this one is a flow level, and if in this case we don't have flow level, so the default will take care of it. But in here for the processor level, we are putting one error continue. So what will happen? Let's see what is happening. So flow is going well, comes here, then an error happens here, then it will go to here, error continues. This will not get executed because once an error happens in a processor, subsequent processors will not get executed. This one is on error continue, which is red in, green out. So it will send success. So the output from this triscope will be a payload of this one, and everything fine. So it will not, there is no any error. So this will go to here, and subsequent processors will get executed. This payload is being modified here. So this will be our final output with a status code of 200. That's what we are getting here. Okay, so this one, let me check it. This is example 3A. Example 3A. 3A. Send. Come here. So go to the triscope. An error happens. It doesn't continue to the logger, rather it continues to on error continue scope. After this, output is success. So the payload will be modified to error triscope. You see the payload is, you can see it here, error triscope. However, when I click next processor, the payload will be modified and it will be success finished flow. You see, payload is successfully should flow. There isn't any error object. So this one is what we get with the status code of 200. So if I come here, you see success finished flow and status of 200. Now I have a couple of questions. Let's do them together. So we saw example 3A. Let's see example 3B. Example 3B. So the only difference with 3A is on the triscope, 3A it was on error continue, but now it is on error propagate. What do we get? Does it continue to the next processor? So if you have on error propagate here, once it gets an error, it doesn't continue to the subsequent flow. So in this case, 2 pointers to remember. Always in the triscope, after the processor that throws error, all the subsequent flows, all the subsequent processors will not get executed. In this case, we just have a logger. We can have payload, set payload, and so on here. They will not get executed. This one and this one will not get executed. However, in the error handler, if it is on error continue, then it will continue to here. But if it is on error propagate, then it will return this error, and that error goes thrown to the flow level error handler. So this is the triscope. The triscope throws an error when it is on error propagate, whereas when it is on error continue, it doesn't throw error. It throws it continues as if nothing happened. So for this one, the answer will be MuleSoft's default error handler, right? Because let me see your answers. Flow level error handler. Yeah, the status code is 500. Perfect. But still we have error description. Yes, the error description. So by default, the HTTP listener, it is not returning a payload, even if we set payload in the on error propagate, because it is error description. The default is error description, but we will modify it to payload and see in that time it should get the payload from on error propagate. So this one should return not a number with 500. 3B. 3B. Next. Okay. So error will happen here. It will go to on error propagate. From on error propagate, it will not continue to the subsequent processors. Rather, it will go to if we have an error handler here, it will go to here. Otherwise, by default, it will count in. So it stopped. So this is at the try-scope level, it is throwing an error still, as you can see. Before the try-scope level, it was green. So now, if you come here, we see is not a valid integer error with a status code of 500. Let's see the next one. Example 3C. Example 3C, what do we have? Here it is default. Yeah, it is default. Everything is default, basically. Everything is default. What do we get here? We have not added any on error continue or on error propagate. So what do we get, for example, 3C? Yes. Yes. That's right. Perfect. Yes. So default is like on error propagate. So here, error will the error will propagate and it will be handled by the default, and that will return the error, and the error comes to this, to the flow level from processor level default error handler. It goes to flow level default error handler, and it is the same as on error propagate. So the error propagators, and at the end we get the error description and the status code of 500. So if you do 3C and come here, so the triscope level is an error. See, it zooms out to the triscope level, and it is still red. Then we see we get a status code of 500, and is not a valid integer value, which is the error description. Now, let me show you 3. I think we are done with example 3. Now, let's see. Example 4 are a little bit complicated. Pay attention here. So in example 4, what we have is we have a main flow, and in the private flow, we have basically it is private flow. So we have flow level error handler, and also we have object level, the processor level error handler. So let me show you the first example. Maybe this down here. Okay, so this one, let's take it to Google Slide. And paste it here. So, okay, so we have the flow reference here. It will go from here. What's the color? From here. Green will come to here. And error is happening here, in here. So that will go to the default error handler. So this will not get executed. So this has a default error handler because we have not added any error handling scope here. And since this is the same as on error propagates, this will not get executed. So the processor level result will be an error here. The try scope will give an error, and that error will get thrown to the default error handler because we have not on error continue or on error propagate here. And so the response from the private flow will be an error, so it will be red. So if it is red, then it doesn't continue to these processors, and the answer will be a 500 and error description. So let's check that. This is 4A. 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 Send. Come here. Next error. So now an error is happening, and it will zoom out. So the try-scope level is an error. So yeah, that's an error. So if it is an error, it doesn't continue to the next processor. Rather, an error will get to flow reference. And since flow reference is getting an error, then this will be handled by the default, and the same as on error propagate. So it will get an error response here. So the error description with a status code of 500. So this is 4A. Let's see 4B. What do we have in 4B? So 4B, the main flow is default. In the try scope, we have on error continue. And in the private flow, we have also on error continue. So we can't tell what will be the answer for this one. What will be the answer for this one? So see here we have success finished flow, and the payload is here. Try block private flow, error finished private flow. They have this payloads, and here we have success finished private flow payload. So what will be the answer for this one? Yes, perfect. Thank you. Yes. So basically what's happening is the try scope level will be success. So it will continue to here. So the flow reference will get this payload from the private flow. This will be the payload. It will not go to this error handler because the output from the try scope is not an error. So it will continue since the flow reference is getting success. So it will continue, and success finished flow will be the answer. Let's check quickly 4B. 4B. Here. Next. As you can see now, the try scope level is not error, so it continues to the next processor. So the flow reference gets a payload from the private flow, and it continues. So that will be the answer. Success finished flow with a status code of 200 here, and success finished flow here. Next one, what we have next one is 4C. So once we finish this, we will modify the configuration for the listener, and we'll see what we get. 4C, let's see for 4C, we have on error continue in the main flow. on error propagate in the try scope, and on error continue in the private flow. This one also is more or less the same thing. So your responses here. So what will be the result for this one? On error propagate in the try scope, on error continue in the private flow, and on error continue in the main flow. Okay. Okay, let's do this together. So the triscope, at triscope level, it is an error, right? So the error is happening in this processor, in this component. From this processor, the error propagates, the error propagates. So triscope level is an error. If triscope level is an error, it doesn't go to the next processor, so it will not go to this one. So the error here will propagate to on error continue. And we have on error continue, red in, green out. We are setting a payload here, and it will return success. So success and this payload will come to here. So this should finish basically, because success is coming to the flow reference. Error is not coming to the flow reference. So let's quickly check this for C. For C, if you have some ambiguities here, please do the assignment, download the project, first think and put your answers and confirm them by running in debug mode. And that way it will help you to understand it well. So next. So this one, it will be, the triscope level will be an error, right? So this one, as you can see, it is an error. However, this error is going to on error continue, and this will return to the flow reference a success. So that is why the main flow is continuing until the end, and it gives us finished flow and 200. Okay, perfect. Now let's see for D, what we have in for D. So in 4D, we have on error propagate in the main flow. We have the triscope, it doesn't have anything. So it will be the same. The default is on like on error propagate. And here we have on error continue. So this one should also be the same thing, right? I'm just giving examples with slight modification so that you can just understand it well. Otherwise, this is more or less the same as the previous one. The only thing is in the main flow, whether you have on error propagate or on error continue, it doesn't matter if success is coming from the private flow, right? So you can disregard what is here. But here, since we have on error continue, even if error happens in the try scope, and the default is like error propagate, here the output from error continue will be success. So this also will finish, and the success finished flow should be the output. Let's quickly check this. So this one is 4D. 4D. Next, let's go here, come here. So the triscope level is error. You see it is an error, but error continue, on error continue will resolve it in the private flow error handler, and success is returned here. So it returns a success. You can come here, see finished flow, and status of 200. Last one, let's see the last one. 4E. Yeah, 4E is the last one. So let's see for 4E, on error propagate in the main flow. What matters is what we have here. We have on error propagate in the private flow also. We have also in default in the triscope. So the triscope will be an error. That error will be thrown to on error propagate. On error propagate is read in, read out. So it will throw it to the flow reference. The flow reference will throw that error to on error propagate, and on error propagate sends that error to the caller, to the listener in this case. So we can check that, which is example 4E. So change this to E, send, and come here. So the try scope level is an error. It goes on error propagates. That will send an error. Flow reference is getting an error. That now it will not go to the subsequent processors, rather it will go to an error propagate. Next. And what we get here, if we come, is status of 500 and is not a valid integer. Now let's make a little bit of modifications. Pay attention here, please. So let's modify this. So let's say in the output, okay, what we can do is this one is handling errors. Let's create handling errors too, another project. Okay, handling errors too. And move this, finish. And so I will copy the code from here. Just copy. To copy the code, you can just go to this configuration XML and copy it. Then I will remove what I don't want. Come here and modify them. Paste it here, and I will close. I will close this one. Handling errors, the project. I will close it and focus on the new project. And on the new project, I don't need this one. Don't need this one. I don't need this one. We just want to see the examples only. Just like this. And if you see this one's grayed out, you simply need to add the module. So if I add now, for example, validation, this one will be active. Like it looks inactive now. So now just add the version, the most recent version should be fine. Yep. So we have this example is, let me save it. Now in the examples, we will make some modifications. I don't need at the end also, I have this one, I don't need it. I'll delete it. So you can delete from the code itself or from the flows. Usually I use the code only for copy pasting, replacing, moving around and stuff. Otherwise for deleting, you can just delete the flow itself. So now let's make modifications to, let's make modification here. What do we have in the listener? Listener, come here under response. Okay, the value I'm touching it, our interest is in the error response. So the error response, this one, output, text plain, error description, this one we will replace it by payload. And the status code here, we'll replace it by vars.status code, and we'll create a status code in the error handler itself. So let's see if we can do this in the code itself. Should have done this before the class, I think. Okay. So let's start with example. If you go to flow example, it starts as flow A is here. This one is flow A. So it starts with a flow tag, and it has a name here, and the flow tag is here. So what do we see here? There is a configuration specified there. Let me see, or else we can modify it manually. Okay. I think the default doesn't show here, it's same. So what we can do is, it should be easy to modify it here. What we can do is just to go here, and for all of them, in the responses, I will change this by payload. And make sure this is FX. And for vars, make this an expression, and vars.status code. We'll create a status code variable, and just copy this at least. I can paste it in the next listener and the other listeners. So come here also. And the responses, one is a payload, and one is status code. So we did 1A, 1B, let's do 1C, and this one. Because in the error handler itself, we are creating payloads, and we want to return custom text message. So that is how we can do that. But we create a payload there, and in the error handler, and that payload gets returned here. So put payload here, run the same thing. We can do example 1 first. So let's see, and also let's start with example 1A. On error propagate, I'm going to create a variable that contains status code. When it is 200, I mean, that 200 is success. When it is error on error propagate, let's say we want to create the status code. Let's say we want to modify it to 700. So here, this one, so it is status code, right? Status code, and its value is 700. And adding a variable here, come here also on error continue, and let me do the same thing. We'll see the difference. So on error continue is 200 by default. So let's just leave that. Or let's make this 201 to discriminate between 200, to see the difference when it returns 200 from success and 200 by the default status code versus 200 from this variable. And C, on C, we don't have anything. Okay, so now let me refresh this. I hope this will work, or else I have to say successfully reconnected. Okay, and so let's start with 1A. So in 1A, what will happen is an error is being created here, is number, then it comes here, and we are creating a payload. The payload here is error main flow, and the status code is 200. Well, let me take this to Google Slides and explain in detail. Paste it here and move this around. So what's happening is an error like before will be created here, and the error will propagate to here, and this is on error propagate, which is read in, read out, but we are creating a payload and variable, and we said on this all the processors on the error handling scopes get executed in the order that they are put here. So we are creating a payload here, and we are creating a variable here. Since this is on error propagate, it is read in, read out, so it doesn't continue to the next processors. We not go to here. Rather, the result from here gets returned. But here in the HTTP listener, when it is error, the response is not now error description. It is rather the payload, which is this one. Error main flow is what it will return. And the status code, before it was 500 by default, but we have overwritten it now, so it should return this 700. We will quickly go over the examples now. The only thing is just there are modifications in the response in the HTTP listener itself, so it should be easy. Okay, so this will work, I think. Yeah, deployed here.
Yeah,
they have many flows. Yeah, because they have many flows. That is why we see many lines here after the status. Yeah. Okay. So let's see with 1A. We modified 1A BC. Then we'll modify 2 also and continue like that in the next 20 minutes. So 1A error happens here. Okay. Then it gets thrown to the on error propagate. Okay. There is a payload in the status code variable 700, and in the response here, what we are getting under error response is not error description, but payload, the last payload, it is not this one. It will not go to this one, this processor. The last payload is the last payload from the on error propagate scope itself. So it will give us error main flow and 700. Okay, perfect. Let's see. Example 1A, send. Come here. Come here. Yes. Yes. Now, if you come here, okay, what is, okay, this one, error main flow, sorry. When talking flows, I didn't make modifications appropriately, okay. But, okay, what the status code is 700. Yeah, main flow, right? Did I make it main flow? Yeah, sorry.
Main flow.
Yeah. Main flow. Save it. Send the request again. And come here. Next. Oh, it is, yeah, it is.
It's not yet deployed.
Yeah. In the meantime, let me make sure this is main flow. Error main flow, this one is main flow. Once here, I don't have anything. Okay. Okay, perfect. This one is successfully reconnected. Now send the request again. Come here. So if you come here now, you see, now it is not error description, it is error main flow, which is a payload from the on error propagate scope. And the status code is a new status code we put, because in the HTTP listener response, we configured the response, what we should get. We modified it. Let's see 1B. In 1B, we have on error continue. If it is on error continue, the status code is, we know it is just 200 because it is success. And also it will continue. Oh, okay, yeah, it is on the status code is 200. Here what we have put is 201. Let me make the same number. Oh, it doesn't matter. So it is going to return the last payload. And since this is in the calling flow itself, once an error happens here in the is number, it doesn't continue to the next processors. So that means our last payload will be this payload, the error main flow, right? Yeah, error main flow. So now the response is this payload. The response is this payload, but the status code is 200. Let's check 1B. Send here. Next. So if you come here, the status code is 200, whereas the response is the payload still, because we have payload in both cases. In both cases, we have the last payload. The only difference is the status code. When it is success, it is getting this payload on error continue as a success from, I mean, with the success response with the last payload, whereas for the error propagate, it gets this as an error from the on error propagate scope. So that is 1B. What about 1C? What do you think we'll get from 1C? Your responses, please. 1C. Who can guess 1C? 1C, it is default.
$500 and error description.
Oh, the error, we don't have error description here.
Oh, it's a payload, okay.
This is a payload, and this is vars.status code. Because we modified, for example, example 1, ABC.
It's a payload number. Okay.
So it is an error, yes. Here an error happens. So this part and this part will not get executed.
Will not be executed.
Yeah. So the response will be the last payload, which is this one.
Started flow.
Yeah.
Success started flow.
Yeah, but we don't have this variable. So status code, it should not give us a status code. I think. Let's see what it gives us. 1C.
Okay.
Send. Here. Next. Yeah, because we don't have any error handling scope. the response. Oh, okay. If it doesn't get it,
500.
yeah, if it doesn't get
Yeah.
it, then it gives 500. But this
The
one,
default, that means.
yeah, the default. If it doesn't get it, it gives the default. But this one, it is
Success started
the
flow.
payload. Yeah.
Yeah.
The payload, which is this one, the payload we have here. This is the last payload we have. After that, we have not modified the payload. Now let's see in example 2. We copy the code from here. Especially, it will be interesting in examples beyond 1, 2, 3, and 4. So here, I'll copy this and responses, status code. Oh, not here. And here, which is the payload.
Payload.
Yeah, it's a payload. This one should be here. 1, 2A, and 2B. Response. Go down here, modify this to payload. And this one, status code, and 2C. Responses go down here. This is payload, and this one is the status code. So that means we have now to create a variable with status code, like what we did here. Example
on the error.
Yeah, example 2A. So example 2A, it is, we don't have any error handler. It is default. Yeah, so that means the status code will be 500 because that variable doesn't exist from what we have seen. Whereas the response is the last payload. Which means it will stop here, right? It will stop here. So this one doesn't get executed. And until we get here, the payload we have is what we have by the time it gets to the flow reference. And by the time it gets to the flow reference, the payload we have is this one. So it should give us, yeah, it should give us this one. This payload goes up to here, and that payload comes to here. Then once it encounters an error, it stops moving forward to the next processors. So it should return an error object, a payload, and we don't have the status code. The status code will be the default that it should give us success started flow now. Let's check that. Example 2A. Example 2A. Did I save it? Let's see. Oh. This one's. Make sure it is really clean. Okay. So next, here, has comes the private flow. And until then, we'll see what the payload is. You can see here, the payload we have is success started flow. Whatever payload it has until it gets here is what will be returned because it will not move next to this one. So click next, that gets returned. Come here, success started flow with 500. Now let's see the next example, which is 2B with that modification. I hope doing this all examples will help you to understand it better. So in 2B, what do we have? 2B, we have a variable here, I mean a payload. Let's add a variable also. And the variable name is status underscore code. And this one is 700.
700.
So let's do like this and save it. And until this gets redeployed, we can think what to expect. So, okay. So until the flow reference, the payload is success started, it comes the private flow, an error happens here. There is an error continue here, which is red in green out. The payload has been modified to error finished private flow. Let me see if the text is like that. Error finished private flow. The payload has finished is modified now. That's the status. It seems the output is success. The status code at the end will be 200. It is returning success to this flow. And since it is success, then the flow will continue. The calling flow will continue. And the answer at the end will be what we get will be success finished flow and 200. Okay. So 2B next. Come here. Next. As you can see, it continues until the end. So this one is the same as like before. Success finished flow and 200. What about 2C? So all of these, I have them as exercises in the Google slide. I mean the GitHub repo. So you can get them from there and practice. So we have 2C. Let's see 2C. It is on error continue again here. We have on error continue here also. And in this one, it is success, right? So if it is error continue in the private flow, it goes until the end, and the result is success. So in the Google slides, it is the one that has more green. This one at the end. So 2 green rectangles. So if you have on error continue here, whether you have on error continue or on error propagate here, it doesn't matter. It will go until the end. So you get success here. That is 2B. We can skip it. 2C. 2C. What did we see? We saw 2C already. Let's see 2D. 2D, we have on error propagate here and an error continue here. The same thing, as far as we have on error continue in the private flow, it will continue up to the end. 2E. 2E, we have on error propagate here, on error propagate here. So let's add a variable here. And name is, the value is just 700. Here, status code, and this one is bars.status code. Oh, sorry, yeah, not vars, just status code is a name and the value is 700.
700.
Yeah, okay. So let's see now what is happening. Since it is on error propagate at the bottom, what do we get on the private flow? So this will throw an error, but the payload and the variable will also be returned to the calling flow, the flow reference. So it is returning an error here. And from this error, from the flow reference, the error also will propagate to here. So our answer, our final answer will be the payload, which is this one inside main flow. And our variable, let's say here it is 700, and let's say here, let's make it 770, add another variable to see which variable comes. So this one, status code, 770. So the variable, it is being modified. Here it was 700 because it is the same variable name. It was 700 here. The payload was inside private flow. When it comes here, both are being modified. The payload is inside main flow and the variable is 770. We can add a logger here and see as mule event structure changes. So I save this and come here, move this here, clear it, and this is it 2E. 2E. Send. And down here, I want to show you what the payload and variables we have are here. So the payload is in here. First, the payload we have is success started flow, which is from this one, from the main flow. Now it will go to the private flow. The private flow creates an error, and it goes to an error propagate. So that is why now the payload will be modified and will be inside private flow. This payload will change. And right now we don't have a variable, but here we will have a variable of 700, status code of 700. So if you see now, our payload is inside private flow, and we have a variable with status code of 700. Click next. That gets returned to here. Still, I mean, so the whole mule event gets returned. We have seen the mule event structure when we use flow reference with flows and subflows, with subflows and private flows. So we see the payload is there from the private flow, which is inside private flow, and the status code is also here. But now we have an error object that is not resolved. So it will go to on error propagate. When I click next, it comes here. Now both of them, the payload and the variable, will be modified. The payload will be inside main flow, and the variable value will be 770. Next. As you can see, my last payload is inside main flow, and my status code last value is 770. Since this is on error propagate, it will not continue to here, rather this gets returned, is what we said. So if we come here, did I finish things? Oh, did I modify for 2E, by the way, in the response, what I should get? Oh, it is still error description. I'm sorry, I thought I modified this. So payload, I guess, let's just, the rest, example 3 and 4, you can experiment yourself and see. Run it in debug mode and understand. Modify the default response and experiment. So this one is reconnected. Next, so let's submit, and the request come here. We have seen already step by step. Let's see the response. So it should be this inside main flow, and status code of 770 is what we are saying. Come here, status code 770, you can see it here, and response inside main flow. So yeah, we modified, for example, this 1 and 2. We can modify, for example, 3. Let's just modify maybe example 4. Some of them. Let's modify example for E. For example, for E, just 1 should be enough. So under responses, here, response, this one, we change it to payload. And this one, status code. This one. Now let's add variables here. And status code 700. And in this one, we don't have error handler, so it will be default. Here we have on error propagate. I can add a variable again. Status code, status underscore code, and let's say this one is 701. So save this. This one will be our last example. I hope you understand it now, and you can experiment more by rerunning them, like what we did. This happens at 15 minutes. This is a perspective of class solves a problem. Okay, so for E, let's first think what the answer will be, then we will check it. Okay, so flow reference here, referencing a private flow, which is for E here. And the private flow has a processor level error handler or triscope. This triscope, it doesn't have error handling scope, so it will be the default one, which is like error propagate. It will propagate the error. And from when we zoom out from the triscope the triscope is like as one processor response returning an error. So that error, since it is error, it will not continue past the triscope. So it's that error will come to this error propagate. In the error propagate, we are modifying the payload and the status code. So this is on error propagate, it will return error to flow reference. So the flow reference is getting an error, so it will not continue to the subsequent processors. Rather, this error will be thrown to this on error propagate, and on error propagate or on error continuous scopes, all the processors get executed. So that in their order. So here we have this one will be inside main flow, will be the last payload, since it will not go to here. That will be our last payload. Had this been on error continue, it will go up to the end and the payload will be modified. But since now it is on error propagate, this will be our last payload. And our last status code is 700, not 701. So we should get a status code of 700 and a payload of inside main flow. So this is example 4E. 4E. Then come here. It is in the try scope. Try scope changes an error. It comes to this on error propagate. Continues. This will still the error object is there. It hasn't been resolved as you can see here. So that's why we call it read in, read out. It comes to flow reference. Flow reference getting an error object. If there is no error, this error object should not be there. Since there is error object, it will be this processor will not be executed. It will go to this on error propagate. As you can see, it comes here. Still the error on the error object is there, and we are modifying the payload. So the payload, it was inside private flow. Now it will be inside main flow. Inside main flow, and the status code, it was 701. Now it will be 700. And what we should get in such cases, always we have said, even if there is an error in the listener, we have modified the response body to be the last payload and the response code to be the status code last value. So it should return this status code and this payload inside main flow and 700. Come here inside main flow and 700. So you can experiment by modifying it like